Welcome to Stuck, Time to Improv. I'm Mary Scott with Business Drift, and I want startups to be wildly successful. One of the kinds of startups is a family business, and they have some unique challenges. And I'm very happy that our guest today is Lowell Mora from Impact CFO. Thanks so much for coming, Lowell.
Thank you for having me, Mary. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
So let's talk about what are some unique challenges to family businesses?
Oh, what is not unique challenges with family businesses? The challenge is that in a family-owned business, many times it's not only um, a business, it's the business owner and the family's livelihood. It's also in a lot of cases, and some of this is generational, their identity, right? And you have a legacy piece to it. So it's very, very complicated. And then you start putting people in, and it always gets a little more complicated. So
Yeah.
that's the biggest thing, I think, that's the biggest challenge.
I would think that distinguishing between business and personal is particularly difficult in family businesses. So I would also think that being real specific about job descriptions can be helpful. Is that your experience too?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you hit on something else. Job descriptions are very particular because too many times in the business, the ownership structure isn't laid out clearly as you would think it would be, right? That it's not who's owns what portion and all that. And just because your name is something doesn't mean that you're an heir to that business. It's legally set up that way. And then if you work in the business, the people that are working in the business, they're getting paid a fair wage for the work that they're doing. And they need to get paid commensurately for their value to the business. Many, many times you see in businesses where people are getting paid far more than the contribution they're making just because their name is such and such and is on the business. But you go to a job description, sure, a job description is very, very important because that's what does the person add to the business. It ties even more to I kind of say it this way: just because you have the name of the somebody running the business does not mean that you're qualified to run the business. So many of the next generation and people's children are self-selecting out because they either say, that's not what I want to do with my life. That's not of interest to me. That's not what I want to do. But there's still a fair number of people that are going into the business and they don't, quote unquote, have the chops to do the jobs that we're asking them to do. And that causes a whole nother set of problems because you're probably paying them above market rate. And then you have to pay somebody else to do what they're theoretically doing.
Right. And it's about skill sets. If you really want your kid to inherit your business, you have to start training them when they're teenagers, if not before, and verifying that they have the skill sets they need for a particular job.
Yeah.
Also, salaries should be commensurate with non-family members in the same position in other companies.
Yes. That is very difficult to maintain. And I can understand the perspective of a business owner, right? If you have a family member or a child who's maybe not doesn't have the earning potential that some of the other children do, you figure I'm going to be paying this person anyway. Why don't I pay them through the business? But it does you a long-term detriment. I think it does a long-term detriment to the person, and then it also does the long-term detriment to the business because when you get towards
Sure.
exit or transition or valuation, then you have, call it, phantom expenses in the business and things that are difficult to unwind.
And it can contribute positively or negatively to corporate culture and whether or not you retain additional employees and what their productivity is going to be. One of the most successful family-owned businesses is a big wine company. And they always have a relative as the CEO, but it's not always a direct line. Sometimes it's the cousin, sometimes it's
Mm-hmm,
the uncle, but it has to do with who has the skill sets and is closest in line to the company philosophy.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, and that company philosophy or the tradition can change over time as well. And a lot of these businesses are staying stuck in, archaic ways and archaic times. And you're seeing that more than ever now with the very rapid um, influx of call it technology now. I don't like to talk about AI too much. Most of my clients don't even know what AI is. I'm trying to get them to use simple automation and process and making things more simple. But if you fall behind on that and too much of that, then eventually you're not going to be competitive, and it's going to affect your pricing and it's going to affect your margins. And
Do you have a good example of a tip of how to recognize a problem and then how to address it?
well, I mean, the problems are usually pretty self-evident. For instance, a great example is not being modern on your banking practices, right? A company now today that's sending out everything, paying everything by check and abhors the use of an ACH or anything like that. It's just drilled into somebody's brain that that's the way you would do something, and not that you need to be more modern. And instead of avoiding fraud, you're actually more open to fraud than you would think other ways. That's an example. I mean, there's a lot of examples in these businesses. Typically the beginning of the learning curve is good. They send them to university. They say, go to college, get a degree, and then go work for somebody else for a while. But then they go to work for somebody else for 2 to 3 to 5 years. And then they go into a business and then they do the same thing the way they've done it for 30 years. And in typically smaller to mid-sized businesses, most of the business I work with businesses I work with are 5 to 50 million in sales. You don't have deep bench strength. You don't have strong management teams. So you're not learning other things. So you need to bring in people from the outside to understand how things are different. My career went very differently, and I've worked over the last 35 years. I worked for 8 different companies. It wasn't necessarily intentional. It's the way it kind of worked out. I worked for a good mix of, I was an auditor for 3 years, then I worked for some big publicly traded companies. And then the last 25 years, I worked for family owned businesses. So I say I've just seen a lot of stuff, right? Because I've had the opportunity to do a lot of different things, and I've had an opportunity to see a lot of stuff. So when I get into a business situation, most things that come at me is in some very derivation of something I've seen before. And anything that I've never seen, I can usually figure out. But people that have been in the same business forever, especially, talking about, all the back office stuff, that's easy and that's whatever. But, there's anecdotal behavior. Well, what are you doing to grow your sales and marketing efforts? Well, we don't do marketing because we did a trade show 23 years ago and it didn't work. And what about outbound marketing? Well, that doesn't work for us. Well, we know all our customers, we know the pool. I go, well, that's not really the case. And you have to modernize and you have to start doing things a little bit differently. But people are very comfortable doing what was done. And especially if they're making, it's hard to distinguish if you're making money, but it's hard if you're making enough money, and I don't know what enough money means, or if you're maximizing the earnings potential of your business and the efficiencies. And that's a really hard thing to get across with business owners.
Well, this has been absolutely fascinating, and your wealth of information. I'm sure there's way more things we could talk about, but we're out of time. So thank you again, Lowell Mora from Impact CFO. We'll put your contact information in the comments so people can get a hold of you later. And I'm Mary Scott with Business Riff. I want startups to be wildly successful, and one of the best things you can do to accomplish that is book a call with me at businessriff.com. And join us again next time for Stuck, Time to Improv.